The first sound on the tape is rain. Not the kind you know from standing under a gutter or waiting for a bus. It has weight, like gravel falling onto glass, steady, relentless. I shouldn't have this recording. It came to me mislabeled, tucked into a folder among declassified government reels, pushed out online in a long list of unremarkable files. But when I pressed play, it was unlike anything else in that batch. At first, I only heard rain. Yet within minutes something else pressed forward beneath it. Faint and strange, the hum cut through slowly, as if testing the edges of my headphones. I thought it was feedback from the recorder. I checked the leads, the dials, the meters. Everything spoke clean. No buzzing lamp, no interference on the input. Still, the hum remained, steady and patient, like the breath of something held underwater. It was not inside the room. It was inside the tape dot. Each loop brought me closer. Every time I replayed the file, the hum seemed sharper, clearer. The rain itself behaved differently too. Segments extending where no digital splice existed, drops striking at new intervals as if aware of my attention. I wondered if it was an artifact of tape decay. But there was no dust, no crack of brittle medium. The reel sounded young, alive. I searched the other files from the drop. Most were dull, bursts of telemetry chatter, ground-to-air callouts, cataloged weather scans. But when I dug into the metadata of the rain recording, one label appeared, crude but full of weight. Operation Fishbowl. The name rang faint in my head, like I had heard it once in passing years ago. I pulled old references. Cold War, high-altitude detonations, attempts to push against the sky itself. The rain did not belong among these munitions logs, yet here it was, smuggled between coordinates and countdowns. I stopped for a while, convinced I was letting my imagination fold shapes into the noise. Hours later I returned, headphones snug, the room dark. The rain greeted me again, rhythmic but swollen with a hidden current. As I leaned in, my gut tightened. The hiss carried weight behind it, a density like pressure on glass. Raindrops rose and fell, but the hum pressed low, an undercurrent that seemed less like weather and more like presence. I tried analysis. Simple spectrum tools, nothing advanced. Rain carries broad bands, messy scattering like static. But this was different. The hum resolved clean, unwavering at a narrow line, as steady as industrial tone, yet placed too deep to be practical. It did not drift over time. It anchored itself, as if locked to a power grid pulse that didn't belong in a storm. That precision unnerved me more than the sound itself. Precision meant intent. I told myself it could be a ground loop, some captured artifact from bad wiring. But the hum carried texture, soft modulation, like lungs struggling underwater. A bare rasp beneath tone. I turned the gain higher, nearly tearing my ears before I stopped. Each increase drew out new edges, subtle rises and drops, hardly uniform. It reminded me more of a living diaphragm than current. By then my room was heavy. Every replay layered onto the last. I held my breath without realizing. Outside, drizzle hit my own window, faint but steady, rushing against the artificial rain bleeding from headphones. For a moment both rains aligned, and I could not tell them apart. The hum rode across real drops, bending them, commanding them. I ripped off the set, heart stuttering. I tried sleeping but found myself restless. Each sound in the night carried resemblance. The whir of the refrigerator, the wheeze of old pipes, it all echoed that hum. At 3 a.m, I surrendered and played the tape again. The same rain welcomed me, thick, endless. Yet now the hum arrived quicker, uncoiling sooner than before. Had the file changed? I checked the waveform, identical. Still, my ears swore otherwise. My perception itself was shifting, bent toward its rhythm. I thought about Fishbowl. Explosions thrown into the upper atmosphere. Man forcing fire into the vault above us. The tests were framed as defense experiments, shielding against missiles. Yet some whispered they were attempts to rupture the sky, to see if the heavens could be broken into signal. What if that rupture never closed? What if the rain is not rain at all, but the lasting scar of that breach, rinsing across time? Heat flushed my skin as the hum escalated for the first time, blooming wide like a breath taken to capacity before sinking again. It carried a shape, not pitch or melody, but intent, like a door pressing against its hinges, waiting to swing open. My palms tingled. I knew this wasn't an accident of tape. It was a witness account, carved not with ink but with vibration. And now I was reading it with my body. In those hours I decided one thing. This was not random. This was not weather. The sound had been sealed into a reel under the cover of ordinary names, lost in bureaucracy until it slipped online. And now, somehow, it had reached me. I followed too many threads in the past, but this one hooked deeper. Maybe because it whispered in sound rather than text. Maybe because it felt closer, intimate, unavoidable. Each time the tape looped, the rain shifted. Drops hit with a new stagger, not natural but deliberate. Paired with the hum, it seemed to form a language beyond words. My ears ached, my mind pressed outward, craving to hear what waited just past the hiss. Yet I could not reach it with tools or logic. Only with attention. Only by giving myself more of its time. I pressed record on my own machine, layering rain over rain, hum over hum, creating a cascade that might tease out hidden shape. The playback emerged darker, deeper, as if the act of duplicating invited something closer. I could not tell where my recorder ended and the tape began. The hiss curled inside itself like a breath drawn before speech. Something is waiting. I feel it in every layer of sound, coiled within hiss like a presence refusing to break surface. Tonight I promise myself one thing. I will keep listening. The second tape begins without warning, dropped into the digital batch like a cracked tooth hidden among ordinary stones. No rain this time. Just a thin hiss, brittle and sharp, the kind that usually fills dead air between transmissions. Yet the more I listened, the more it refused to sit still. The hiss carried agency. It shifted left against my skull, then right, then slipped low beneath, like someone crouching behind me. I lifted my headphones off, half expecting to see a figure there. Only darkness. But the sound had already walked across the room. At first, I thought it was headset drift, cheap wiring pushing the signal to one side or another. I swapped headphones. Same effect. I tried playback through speakers. The sound still drifted, pacing across my desk, then retreating into corners the speakers didn't even cover. The shift wasn't hardware. It was inside the recording. A listener wrote after I shared a small excerpt. He said he felt as if someone was following him down his hallway while it played. He called them footsteps. I had avoided that word, but as soon as I read it, I could not escape it. I opened the spectrogram, a slow sweep across the frequency band. Most noise plots scatter, a wash of grains across the page. This one held irregular columns, slender streaks that leaned, as if tilting their weight forward. Each step forward brought a narrow spike before it fell quiet again. Left, right, behind, over and over. I could almost trace a path across the floor of that plot, as though the static itself had stood up inside the tape and chosen to move. Doubt pressed in heavy. My recorder had to be at fault. The original tape was digitized decades after creation, but maybe my gear layered fresh errors on playback. I removed my trusted machine from the chain. I patched in a field unit one had kept untouched since last summer. Battery-driven, free from household wiring. Within seconds, the static was there again, walking its map across the channels, pacing without hesitation. I let the machine run overnight, its red diode blinking like a restless eye beside my bed. At dawn I played back the file, hopeful that fatigue had fooled me. but no wild birds scattered outside. The static again filled my head. Confident, deliberate, alive. I couldn't shrug it off as quirk. When I traced metadata once more, my chest tightened. The timestamps matched to exact seconds against a handful of declassified logs I pulled years back during another research dig. Those entries were clinical, almost bored, but one line chilled me. Incoherent spectrum patterns noted. Johnston et al., July 1962. I read the line again. It carried the same shape as my file, incoherent spectrum. Back then, a half-century ago, they had heard the same restless static. I cannot answer. But the hum continues, steady, alive. And I know I will follow it because I no longer have a choice. The highway stretched quiet. The rain softened to mist, wipers ticking slowly across the windshield. I kept one hand on the wheel and the other steady on the recorder beside me, its red light glowing faint against the dim of the dashboard. The lead I was chasing sounded thin on paper, a name whispered by someone who still answered phones in grainy preservation offices. A retired technician. Lovefield, they said. He was there that November. The kind of man who had sat among equipment, meters twitching, head tilted to static. I drove thinking he might finally offer explanation, or perhaps only silence, when I pulled into the narrow street. His house looked collapsed inward, blinds drawn, fence sagging. The place of someone who had long ago stopped noticing the world moved outside. I carried the recorder to the porch. I reminded myself not to speak too loudly. Age can be fragile. My knock echoed, then hollow footsteps inside. The door cracked. He looked smaller than the stories I carried. Oxygen tubing looped his nose, machines humming low behind him like tired crickets. When I introduced myself, his eyes narrowed but softened. He let me in without words. The living room was dim, curtains heavy, every shelf stacked with manuals and unused adapters. Machines breathed for him, steady huffs mixing with my own unsettled sighs. I asked plain questions first. Did he recall unusual traffic, cross-feed, anything odd in bands that day? His eyes never left mine, though he stayed silent, expression caught somewhere between warning and resignation. I held the recorder low running, willing even the oxygen machine wheeze to be evidence later. Finally, his hand slid across the table. An index card. Handwriting sharp though shaky, written many years ago perhaps. Just one note, underlined once. 1,750 kilohertz. He offered no other explanation, only placed it beneath my palm as though the weight was his too long to bear. I whispered if this meant something formal, an incident log, but he shook his head once and leaned back, eyes dismissing the conversation. The machines filled the air. He would say nothing more. I left almost apologetically, card in jacket pocket, recorder capturing the faint hiss of machines fading behind me. Outside, the rain picked up again, sharp droplets striking metal roof, a cleansing sound after the airless house. In the car, breath-fogged glass as I laid the recorder in the passenger seat. I stared at the card. A frequency, plain numbers, yet written with certainty. It was not civilian knowledge. Anyone trained knew ranges, knew boundaries. But written clean, almost reverent, like coordinates. I powered on a small portable radio scanner, tuned dial trembling under my grip. The display wavered. I moved slowly upward, through static washes, up into the range. White hiss, empty clicking, then suddenly there. Between stations, a faint thin whistle, threading high above the noise. Not clean tone, not station bleed. A phantom signal buried like a splinter. It coiled inside my ears, sounded not outside but in. I whispered into the mic, speaking description as I had in past entries. There's a whistle. Between bands, not station, not normal environment. My voice shook faintly. Then, impossibly, the whistle shifted as I spoke. Its tone bent. stretched a shade higher, wavering as though answering. I froze. Did it stop? No, it modulated. Like breath pulled inside a flute when air changes. Behind my own words came the faint echo, like sliding note. Nothing, then almost speech, then sheer whistle again. My chest tightened. Every part of logic begged me to dismiss it as overlap, defect, trick of worn tuners. Yet awareness dredged itself up. Old memories of classified files where tones bent exactly when someone logged them with timestamp. Always described as anomalous, never explained. I whispered again into the recorder, slower this time, enunciating nothing, just a hum. The whistle followed, widening, then dipped low as though aware. It was not mere accident. The sense was direct and chilling. The rain outside softened, drumming faint rows across glass. Street lamps glowed through, hazed yellow. But the interior of the car felt unmistakably occupied, every shift of tone filling the small metal chamber, twisting through the air like invisible company. I lowered the dial, switched frequencies, returned again. Still, the whistle reappeared, always writing 1750. My pulse thudded against ribs. The recorder captured it all, the fragile note cutting faintly through hiss but constant. I leaned closer to the panel, ear against poor plastic speaker. Something is here, I whispered. Immediately the whistle slid sharp, stung with sudden intensity, then retreated to steadiness. The modulation felt deliberate listening, replying, perhaps mimicking recognition. My mouth went dry. Breath fogged the windshield once more. It should have been enough to terrify me into silence. But curiosity pinned me forward like a hook through skin. The index card rested against the seat, letters barely visible in gloom. I thought of the technician, silent oxygen machine murmuring like witness. He hadn't spoken because he knew. The number alone was his only confession. A warning, or perhaps a handoff of burden. His silence was protection. My attention, a choice. But I made it when I tuned. Already the whistle knew me. Static pulsed, light, then faded thin. I whispered again into the recorder, though my voice caught. It heard me. I should have turned the dial off then, but my fingers clung. My whole body leaned toward the tuneless note, close enough it felt as if the frequency itself leaned back. Curiosity thickened into dread, but the gap between the two narrowed until indistinguishable. And still the whistle held steady, alive, as if it awaited another word. Tonight the rain sounds different. It isn't rushing, isn't heavy, but the gutters outside drip with slow insistence, tick by tick against metal. I have the microphone angled near the window frame. Every droplet lands, each splash against aluminum ringing like a hollow metronome. The recorder catches it, but underneath there is bleed I had not logged before. Faint interference snake thin, slipping through the plaster, hiding in the hum of my own walls. At first, I thought it was traffic bleed, some power line oscillation outside. But when the showers eased and only the gutter tick remained, the hum persisted. I moved the microphone closer to floorboards, along pipes where waterline runs. Pipes responded. At first subtle, but soon clear. A rhythmic pattern, not unlike heartbeat, rolling through building skeleton. I pressed my ear to radiator. Through bone, the vibration felt undeniable. Pulses slid perfectly in pace with gutter drip, until I wondered which was keeping time. I sat back, whispering my notes as the rain drizzled. I remembered old assignments where strange signal lingered after catastrophe. Airplane crash sites where radio officers swore their bands echoed with phantom, Morse. Collapsed mines where rescue scanners picked bursts, no longer attached to any beacon. Always shrugged off, yet the results recorded. Thin at first, stubborn when ignored. I thought of my father again. His notebooks filled with tallies of night signals reached quiet bands. Back then I called him obsessive. Tonight I traced the same path. The hum gained depth when I changed microphone placement, dragging cable toward the kitchen. Plumbing rattled, then settled into uncanny measure. I tapped spoon to counter. Tap. The pipes replied half a beat later, same rhythm. As though the house exhaled with me. In the recording, I hear it clearer than my memory allowed. Walls groaning, pipes sinking to unseen frequency. I held my breath. Even silence felt corrected into rhythm. As if oxygen itself bound by loop. I clipped sections to play back, isolating noise bursts. Compression sharpened the tone into points. Then I aligned it against an archived JFK speech file I had stored years back. I chose an oration most know, clear diction, recorded clean on reel. I let his words roll underneath the gutter drip. As pulse intertwined with voice, distortion bent his syllables sideways. Ask not, the phrase warped, vowels drowning in low oscillation, consonants flickering. His voice curved unnatural, speaking still, but not his. Hearing it warble unsettled me enough that my stomach knotted. I whispered into recorder that even memory bends once frequency hijacks it. A dog barked 2 floors down abruptly, then whined as if startled. A neighbor's radio switched channel unprompted, carrying faint scratch until muffled with a slam. Then my phone lit bright. Incoming static noise filled the speaker, though no call logged. I turned it face down, let it buzz until gone. Soon after, someone knocked on the wall. Angry, fast. I imagined them shouting about dropped calls, about their lines filling with hiss. I recorded everything but gave no explanation. How could I? If the building had turned conductor, then no one would believe what I recorded through pipes. The air inside grew damp, metallic, as though condensation thickened with charge. I licked lips, tasted iron. The microphone cable vibrated when fingers brushed it, current non-existent, yet undeniable. I thought about disasters leaving behind electromagnetic shadows. How structures recorded events, releasing fragments when aligned right. Was this apartment building one such emitter without history? Or was the event feeding it with sharpness sharper than those past, insisting harder, rewriting space to be vessel? The tape reels wait still, black dots staring upward, unclaimed by catalog, unacknowledged by law. Yet they exist, stacked against their own erasure. And I know, as I replay the memory in my head, that silence is not a void here. It is safeguard, seal. The reel does not offer nothing. It holds something in, straining at its borders, waiting to break through the next time I press play. The disturbance began subtly, like a trick of building pipes or the hum of a distant appliance, something I nearly ignored. Yet when I left the reel looping overnight, the sound thickened and began to stretch itself wider. It pressed beneath the floor, not through speakers, not through air, but through timber joists and plaster seams, vibrating quietly as if the apartment itself had been converted into a diaphragm. I woke in the dark not from a clear sound, but from pressure. My bed frame trembled faintly. A low buzz threaded the silence, a pulse crawling through the floorboards like an animal hunting its exit. My neighbor downstairs knocked on the ceiling the following morning. She was tired, irritable. She asked if I had kept some machine running all night, some old refrigerator motor or faulty speaker. I lied poorly, said I'd check the wiring. But she shook her head and repeated the phrase, buzzing underfoot. She said it wouldn't stop, that it had followed her even into her bedroom, rising out of the floor like electricity. I apologized and closed the door, heart racing. It wasn't in the wiring. It was the reel. I tested it directly. I left the reel silent, unwound. The pressure ebbed and the air remained still. When I pressed play again, the apartment filled once more with that subterranean thrum. My stomach reacted first, tightening. Then came the strange impression of words that refused to form. It wasn't a voice, not truly, but something arranged close to cadence, rising and dipping like syllables caught underneath water. It lurked just beyond interpretation. Whenever I leaned closer, ready to seize a pattern, it fractured into simple vibration, mocking my effort. Sleep became impossible without insulating myself. I began wearing headphones deep into the night. At least then the disturbance was contained against my ears. But even then I caught myself imagining it moving both inside and outside at once. The line blurred until I woke unsure if the noise pulsed in the reel or in my chest. I started logging times in a notebook, marking when intensity spiked, when rhythm bent towards something like inflection. Nights filled with jagged notes, sketches of curves resembling waveforms, arrows pointing at times where the disturbance pretended at speech. My eyes ached, but I forced the data into computer analysis. Spectrum displays flickered across my screen, bands of scattered pressure plotted as pale color. And once, when I layered 9 loops of the reel together, I saw something that chilled me. Not a word precisely, not language as we know it, but a faint contour like a mouth opening without sound. A map of articulation missing the air to complete it. An almost voice forever hiding just behind hiss. I sat very still. The lines bent upward in rhythm a child could mistake for chant. I isolated the region, pushed gain, slowed playback until each spike dragged long across my ears. There it was again, the impression of vowels refusing to finalize, consonants half-born. I froze on the thought, silence holding something in. Could this be the strain pressing outward, trying to cross from geometry into syllable? Hours passed in that state, half crouched at my desk, the glow of spectrum fields burning against my tired eyes. Eventually, I tore my headphones off, paced, wiped sweat from my palms against jeans. I needed someone else's clarity. Isolation had burrowed too deep. I thought of Esther's old friend who once worked in signal intelligence, who had spent years parsing incoherent bursts around the globe. Different career now, quieter life. But if anyone could guess what lived in this reel, it was them. I drafted the message carefully, deleting lines, rewriting phrases. Too much exposure might invite attention if someone still watched these things. I settled with vague wording, anomalous frequencies, layered silence, a shape detected in spectrum fields. I left out the mention of neighbors hearing buzzing underfoot. That detail was mine alone, though I feared it proved contagion more than coincidence. I attached the smallest clip possible and hovered before sending, wrist pressed tangibly against my chest. S had clearance once. Contact still, probably. By writing, by attaching the file, I dragged them into the circle whether they wanted it or not. If these reels had been buried this deliberately, they had been buried for a reason. And yet the pressure in my apartment pulsed heavier each night, growing harder to ignore. Without perspective, I would drown in speculation. Alone, I was one listener vulnerable to illusion. With them, perhaps I could anchor it, translate at least one edge into language. Finally, I hit send. My stomach flipped with instant regret, as though I had thrown open my door and invited something inside. I left the computer glowing, but went to the kitchen sink, ran tap water loud to mask the reel still unwinding in the other room. But the buzz traveled beneath the tiles regardless, crawling up into my bare feet, insinuating itself into my bones. Later, close to dawn, I returned to the machine. I replayed the spectrum contours, pressed replay again and again until the faint mouth shape glowed across the screen like an open curse. I wrote beneath it in my notebook, not silence, containment. Then, in smaller letters barely visible come morning, almost a voice, sleep never came. I lay stiff against the mattress, hearing the disturbance moving in the joists beneath me, as if the building itself breathed from below. My neighbor's complaint echoed sharp in memory, buzzing underfoot. She had spoken the truth, but words failed against what cracked open in my own ears. This wasn't hum. This wasn't interference. It was petition. A voice pressing upward, half-born, straining to be heard. The corridor that led to the archive was never warm, but that afternoon it felt colder than usual. Fluorescent tubes hummed faintly above. and my footsteps echoed longer than they should have down the concrete stretch. As I neared the archive room's door, I noticed someone already inside, a shape moving against the dim light spilling out through the entry glass. My chest tightened. No one was ever here outside staff hours. I slowed my pace, hesitant. When I entered, the figure turned. A man in a gray jacket, hands resting too casually in his pockets, lingered by the tape cabinet. His gaze flicked over me briefly, unreadable, before he moved toward the exit without a word. His shoes barely scraped the linoleum, soundless in a way that unsettled me more than if he had slammed the door. I stood in the threshold, watching his back recede around the corner of the hallway. Inside, the cabinet gaped open. My heart lurched when I saw it. The boxes marked only with black dots, the hidden reels no one admitted were here, had shifted. I had memorized their neat row, their ordered silence on the shelf. Now 3 empty spaces punctured the line like missing teeth. My throat went dry. They weren't misfiled. They were gone. I closed the door behind me, hands trembling at the handle, and checked the sign-out sheets. No entry. No name. No acknowledgement that anyone had taken material. The paper lay undisturbed under faint dust. Whoever the man was, he had walked out without leaving evidence except the absence of reels. My pulse hammered. If those reels were missing now, then someone else was listening, or perhaps locking them away more securely after realizing I had accessed them. Fishbowl ended 6 decades ago. Why would these echoes still warrant shadows in corridors? Could the silence I heard, that pressure straining through outdated tape, still be dangerous enough to draw attention? I touched the shelf, fingertips skimming dust where boxes had once rested. For the first time, the archive didn't feel like refuge, but stage. I was no longer the only one playing audience to this theater of coded hiss. Someone else held a script I wasn't given. I forced myself to check one of the remaining reels, threading it quickly through the player. When I pressed play, the silence bled out into me again, pressing against the headphones. Familiar, but emptier now, less secure. My nerves were too raw, too aware of footsteps recently in the hall. I stopped it within seconds, ears ringing. That night, unable to settle, I returned to the reel I had borrowed days earlier. My apartment trembled faintly as the tape stirred to life. The silence swelled again, but this time something cracked within it. Needles surged forward, meters dancing into peaks, and then sudden and violent, a sharp electronic bloom burst forth. It wasn't tone. It was alarm. Warbling, rising, then falling into coded rhythm. I jolted upright on my chair, headphones biting into ears. The bloom repeated 3 times. Each variation pitched a step different, like signal banners rising one after another. My skin prickled. This was no organic bleed, no vague impression of a voice. This was structured, mechanical, precise. It sounded like alert, a system opening channels to announce itself. The reels had never given me open content until now. They had hinted, pressed, layered. But this was undeniable. I couldn't rationalize it as artifact or technical hiccup. Someone encoded warning into silence decades ago, and 60 years later, it was still alive enough to sound off when touched. I replayed the segment on loop. My notebooks filled with jagged annotations, crude attempts to capture the rhythm. Long, short, short, long, warble, rest. Almost militaristic in cadence, like encrypted Morse, given skin. The thought of it being a distress signal twisted my gut. If it was an alarm, who or what had they been trying to warn? Every repeat deepened my unease. I pressed stop but swore the sound lingered in walls anyway. My own apartment shielding carried it like bone as vibration. Each silence between repeats widened into unbearable stillness, so that when the bloom came, it was relief and terror at once. I thought about the man in the gray jacket. If he knew which reels to take, then he had known the trigger was near. He must have been one step ahead, removing whatever tapes contained sharper bursts than the one I'd caught. Did he know I would press play late at night, that I would document it? Had my access been traced already? I stared at the cassette window where tape reels turned slowly, hypnotic. I imagined the signal bleeding outward, not just in my headphones, but radiating. What if each replay broadcast faintly beyond wires? What if listening marked me, each rotation of reel pinging outward to waiting receivers? The thought made my neck prickle. I leaned back, eyes on ceiling cracks, rain beginning to drift against the window outside. 6 decades and the fragments survived somehow, unquiet, unwilling to settle. Government silence hadn't killed them. Time hadn't either. All suppression had done was press them tight below the surface, until one thread mine tugged at them again. I replayed the bloom one more time before shutting the machine down. Its tone rang in me, even after the tape stopped. It wasn't just noise. It was address. Like being noticed. As I sat in the dark motionless, I realized with hollow certainty, once you hear it, they know you've heard it. And now, so did I. I woke before sunrise, the kind of waking that isn't rest, but a shove from inside the chest. My eyes opened to the pale gray of the window, blinds trembling against a restless wind. I wanted silence, but felt the pressure before I even reached the recorder. Something stretched thin through the air, as if the whole block carried a tone my ears couldn't shut out. I stepped outside with the handheld recorder, its red diode stuttering awake. The neighborhood shimmered in the half-light. Damp pavement, scattered leaves, the still weight of night refusing to leave. Overhead, the power lines hummed different than usual. Not the faint, steady buzz you expect, but a deep groan that bent downward as though strained under invisible weight. The poles themselves seemed alive, cords bowing, each thread vibrating with hidden music. I lifted the microphone toward them. The recorder caught it instantly. Low resonance grinding, an aching tremor that pulsed in time with the empty air between houses. I walked under one line, and my teeth ached faintly as if enamel itself were listening. Each step closer drew that hum sharper, more precise, until I had to look at my levels. Sure enough, the peaks formed steady ridges, perfectly narrow, like the silent reels had carved them. Back inside, I played the reel and paired it against this dawn capture. The hum from the power lines fell into place against the tape's static. Lock and key. The two sounds folded into one another until the separation blurred. It was no accident. The reel hadn't simply been artifact, it was a design, waiting for the right partner to wake it. I kept replaying the layered track, panicked half by discovery, half by awe. The house seemed to vibrate with it, walls flexing slightly, air leaning closer. I reduced the volume, but my ears swore the hum carried on beneath the silence. I pressed my hands to my chest and felt the skin tighten as though my ribs were sympathetic conductors. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself much longer. For days I had logged quietly, documenting alone. But the alignment demanded verification beyond my head. I drew together a short clip, carefully anonymized, sliced tight so as not to reveal the whole cycle. A test, a probe released into the stream where eyes might not know what they heard, but ears like mine could. I attached only the barest note. Have you heard this frequency? I hesitated before sending it out, fingers frozen above the keyboard. The thought traced dirty paths. Some watcher might flag the tones, might trace back, might knock on my door. But then the memory of the gray-jacketed man rose. If someone else was already watching, then silence wasn't protecting me anyway. I sent it. The hours that followed were thick. I sat in the living room without speaking, headphones dangling, expecting nothing. Afternoon came, the hum still radiating faintly from the window glass, a shimmer I could not shake. Then, sometime past dusk, a reply appeared. Single line. A handle spelled only by the letter S. They wrote, "I've heard this too." Buried in military communication bands, during sweeps the first logged years back. Exact cadence, exact contour. I rubbed my eyes, heartbeat sharp. Finally, a contact. Not a hallucination, not just the walls of my apartment reflecting my obsession. Another witness. S's message was clipped, too careful for randomness. They spoke of bursts, not continuous noise. Of patterns hidden in frequencies reserved for defense chatter. They ended without overture, only suggestion. This requires more than writing. We should meet. I stared at that last sentence, reading it over and over while the pressure in the room shifted again. If the reels truly locked into infrastructure, then my street was part of a circuit larger than I could guess. And someone out there, somewhere, already knew the map. I set the recorder on the desk and pressed record once. My voice cracked as I admitted the thought aloud. The sound had been waiting, and now it had answered as arrived cautiously, eyes darting across the cafe before settling into the chair across from me. Their jacket was weathered, a little too large, collar pulled high as though insulation from more than cold. An old briefcase rested by their feet, metal corners scuffed, the lock taped together from years of opening and closing in silence. They lowered their voice at once, skipping pleasantries. I had expected vague talk, indirect language. But S laid bare the truth of their past. Communications analyst, long ago. Swept into service during years when monitoring shortwave bands was both obsession and punishment. They had tracked not voices but shapes of energy, bursts that stained channels reserved for drones and satellites. Fishbowl was not their era, but its shadow? That was still there, decades later. They slid a folded sheet across the table. Hand-drawn, fragile with creases, creased until the ink nearly flaked. At first it was only squiggles of frequency maps, colored pencil lines arcing in waves. Then the patterns emerged, dates and coordinates annotated at the peaks. Not random. Each mark corresponded to a site where something had gone wrong. Missiles failing to launch. Satellites spinning helpless before dying. I stared at one corner where an annotation read 77. Vandenberg abort. Another, 82. Baikonur loss of signal, multiple fallback orders. Year after year. Across oceans, across political borders, always near the faint bursts that looked like noise on ordinary graphs, but bled abnormal presence when magnified. They aren't random, said. Fingers trembling slightly against the rim of their coffee cup. It's propagation. They ripple out like aftershocks, tied to the original detonations. Mark the anniversaries. Watch carefully and the static returns stronger when the date folds back on itself. I ran my hand down the page, stopping at a cluster of dots. That's when I felt heat crawl up my neck. One coordinate nearly aligned with home. Not exact, but same longitude as the county where I had lived as a child, where summer storms always carried restless sound into the house radio. My breath caught. Childhood memory and spectrum chart collided, blurring into certainty I didn't want. Quietly I asked, so the tape? It's not fixed. If it's tethered to date and place, then it's moving, S interrupted. Yes, it isn't confined to tape. You think you're listening safely, boxed sound. But the wave is persistent. Scars don't fade. That's the part nobody likes admitting. I felt the room shrink then. Air thick inside the narrow cafe walls. Every click of silverware against plates, a mimic of bursts. Every scrape like warning. I held the paper tighter, noting how delicate the ink had become. Lines fragile, yet undeniable. S reached into their case again and produced another sheet. This one less map, more log. Dozens of intercepts listed in handwritten shorthand. Each tick marking spikes caught where no signal should exist. I could almost hear them humming from paper itself, the silence in which they had once been trapped straining against ink. You must understand, S said, this is persistence across systems. Not ghosts of machines. Not ordinary interference. I logged bursts echoing weeks after anniversaries. They travel. sometimes in clean arcs, sometimes diffuse, but always tethered. You don't shake them. Their voice cracked slightly on the last words, not with age, but fear, as though remembering something they had once overheard, something that should not have crossed. I switched on my handheld recorder under the table, red diode hidden from view, though I suspected S knew anyway. Their tremor had to be captured, preserved, not just their map. My hands shook against my thighs. I thought of those childhood storms again, of lying awake while thunder rose. The family radio had picked up distant stations at odd times, voices warping into static. Back then we joked about foreign weather broadcasts piercing in, but now I traced the longitude on S's sheet and found myself short of breath. What if all along the sky itself was bleeding through? Across the table, S exhaled long, weary. You've heard too much already. That's how it gets you. Once heard, you chase. Once chased, it moves. Don't imagine it stops at recordings. That's the falsest comfort. Their cup rattled quietly against its saucer. Their other hand tapped wrist bone nervously. They repeated softly, almost unwilling, "What you're hearing doesn't stay on tape. It travels." Their words landed inside me harder than the bloom on the reels had. The bloom was sound. This was confession, witness carved into human throat. For a moment neither of us spoke. The cafe noise pressed in meaningless. Chatter, laughter, spoons clinking. Thin mortal sounds that folded beneath the weight of what S had given me in paper and voice. I pressed the recorder tighter under my palm, aware of its diode blinking faint. The tremor in their tone lived inside the machine now. It shook not just their breath, but my own. A crack in their professional control. The thin crack where long-buried fear slid through Dot as we parted. S slipped the map back into their briefcase, but left me one corner of note, torn small, enough to anchor reference. Our eyes met only briefly. They turned away quick, shoulders hunched as if already shrinking from whatever consequence might follow. I walked into dusk, clutching the tiny paper. Listening already to the hum building in wires above. I found the transcript buried inside a sheaf of scanned files, deep in a folder misnamed as weather logs. Its header marked it plain, top secret. Strange to see the designation, against a faded piece of paper where ink had bled at the edges, time-stamped long before disclosure laws were forced into place. I read the words slowly. They weren't technical in the ordinary sense. They carried unease disguised in military jargon. One passage described auroral curtains. Not simply light, not charged particles, but curtains transmitting coherent audio beyond human speech. The phrasing struck me hard. Beyond human speech. As though the sky itself was forming not language, not words, but something structured almost language. Shapes you could almost understand but never fully hold. The author listed it with the care of someone fearing disbelief. Deeper in the document, another notation nearly stopped my breath. A test officer wrote of a pilot. Mid-flight, the pilot had abandoned his controls entirely. Ground crew screamed at him by radio, but he refused to respond. Upon recovery, the officer claimed, the pilot insisted that he had heard his dead brother's voice over comms. Clear, insistent, impossible. A voice tethered by nothing but charged aurora above the Pacific. That line sat underlined 3 times in fading pencil. Someone had realized how damning, how destabilizing it would sound. And yet, it had survived, misfiled, waiting decades until my own eyes drew across it, in a dim room. I felt cold, as if the pilot's silence lingered even through documentation. Had he doubted his own senses, or trusted them enough to release the stick? I thought back to the reels, the way silence pressed outward, like trapped atmosphere. I thought of the static that walked across my floor. And I realized what these fragments meant when joined together. The signals weren't just bursts of interference. They were mimics. They leaned toward familiarity. They shaped themselves according to memory. A man hears his dead brother in a burst of cum noise. I hear a mouth shape pulsing behind spectrum patterns. Each exposure reflects what matters most, what wounds linger deepest, as though sound reaches across grief and presses its form into you. I sat at my desk with the transcript lit by the weak lamp glow. My recorder waited. I had played witness long enough. At once reckless and careful, I decided to test. I would read the excerpt aloud into tape, capture it layered over the reel, see if the shadow in silence reached back at my voice. My palms sweated as I pressed record, heart stalling, then thudding. I read the lines softly. Auroral curtains transmitting coherent audio beyond human speech. The words already seemed alien as they left my mouth, phonemes stiff as glass. I continued until I reached the passage about the pilot and his brother. My voice cracked, ugly in its admission. For a moment I thought about my own losses, people whose names I no longer utter out loud. I forced the line through my lips and stopped. The reel spun with faint whine. My voice carried onto it alongside the embedded silence. Then I rewound, bracing my heart, and pressed play. At first the expected. The sound of myself reading line by line, faint tape hiss around syllables. Then it happened. Barely a second behind me, another voice emerged. Not separate, not external. My voice, again. Delayed, echoing, fractionally warped, as though my words arrived from behind glass, leaning a breath too late. I froze. One track had become two. My mouth and the shadow mouth layered together. It wasn't feedback, too clean for that. The echo hit every pause, exactly a beat after me, a faithful mimic with strange intimacy. It spoke with me, repeating all I said, but shifted higher in tone, as though pitched through stretched film. I pressed the headphones hard to my skull, heart racing at the sound of myself multiplied. Each recited word crawled up my neck like cold fingers. When I reached the sentence about the pilot, my echoed self pronounced it again seconds later, thinner, almost tremoring. The recording machine needles spiked higher then, almost off scale, before dropping back into nothing. My skin crawled. I played it a second time, controlling breath as if silence around me mattered. Again the overlay repeated, my twin shadow voice inhabiting the transcript, as though it belonged there long before I did. This was different from walking static, different from hidden bloom. This was recognition. The reel's new articulation when given it and mirrored it back, delayed proof that containment still leaked through when pressed. I felt my throat dry, my voice thick from trying to swallow. These were not tapes to document history. They were still alive, waiting for input. If a pilot could hear his brother, then so could I hear myself echoed back. Mimicry, parasitic repetition, built into the architecture of silence. They learn by us, shape by us, replay us. At one point, during the third playback, I swear the shadow trembled apart from me mid-word, forming an ending I had not spoken. No syllable I recognized, but cadence clear, like a word from some language neighboring human, brushing close enough to frighten but not to translate. I stopped the reel then, lungs shivering, palms clammy against the desk wood. I leaned over notebook, hand shaking as I wrote. It speaks with me. It delays a breath, never ceasing. Shadow voice. Almost me. Perhaps more than me. I underlined those words, pressing pencil until the page tore slightly. The transcript lay beside me still, corner curling upward under lamp heat. Dead brother's call echoing across Aurora decades ago. My own echo caught tonight, layered just behind my throat. Different men, different decades, same trap sounds leaning into memory, answering in voices that should not come. Even now, hours later, the delay lingers in me. I speak under breath only to test, and swear I feel the lag trailing afterthought, as if the reel reshaped my timing permanently. Recognition seeds itself slow. It was never silence. It was mirror. And tonight it finally looked back enough to say my words a second time, The hours I spend at night with the reels are starting to hurt me. I tell myself it's the lack of sleep, the stale air in my apartment, maybe too much caffeine burned too late. But around the third night in a row, when my nose suddenly opens and runs red without warning, I know better. The hum lives inside my body now. The pressure I described in notebooks with calm detachment is moving through me like a current. Headaches bloom sideways across my skull, flashing white behind the eyes, sharp and splitting like glass breaking under the skin. The migraines arrive worst after I stop listening, as if my brain protests the interruption. I walk to the bathroom, hands clutching counter edge, half bent as vertigo rolls my body, even when the room stands still. That's when memory strikes, storms I never lived through. Images of sky cracking like old film stock, lightning bending wrong across an absent ocean horizon. I see auroras whipping down like green ropes, though my childhood sky never bore that weight. These are ideas the reels press into me, impressions recorded somewhere else, some other time. They arrive whole in my mind, too polished to be hallucination. Sleep is useless. Each crack against eyelids brings new flashes, flooded runways, sirens, countdowns. Places I never stood yet remember with full-bodied clarity. It's like carrying someone else's archives, but without the consent to skip them. My pulse rises quick when I wake, unsure which room belongs to me. I turn again to analysis, because science is the only barrier I can raise. Spectrograms spread across my screen, color bands fracturing into jagged teeth. I trace them with the mouse, stopping at bursts that tear through calm frequency like knives. Each one descends at an angle, sharp enough to resemble lightning frozen in shape. And when I flip through old government detonations logged by date, a map emerges. The bursts align. Each jag like scar tissue in the band pins itself to a test detonation decades old. Look, one near Johnston, one above the Pacific, one attached to later experiments people swore were weather projects. The match tears the last of my doubt. These are not artifacts. These bursts are anniversaries, silent reminders carved inside spectrum that flare at exact coordinates. Lightning across invisible sky, persistent long after shockwaves dissipate physically. My skin feels weak as paper when I match the logs on screen. Desperate to anchor my sanity, I send the data to screenshots, overlays, careful notes. The reply takes longer than before. Hours, then a day. Their message arrives clipped, as short as a breath that doesn't want to continue. I see what you see. I wish I didn't. Nothing else. No analysis, no second image. Only silence that follows like guilt. They begin responding slower after that, hesitant, as if each new fragment I share drags them nearer to a pit they'd sworn to avoid. I feel their pullback like betrayal, though I understand it as fear. Still, alone, I start to sink deeper. Days blur, apartment shades drawn low. Light outside irrelevant compared to the notebooks filling with half-coated sketches of bursts. Pages smell of graphite and sweat. Each line drawn across the jagged spectrograms looks less like science and more like notation. A score of thunder I am rehearsing for no audience else. Then, without warning, something arrives. Folder in inbox, no sender displayed. File named only with date, nothing else. 30 seconds of audio when opened. At first, only static familiar swells like sand against ear. I almost curse at being baited again until the sound tightens. The static holds itself, condenses, begins to strike in pattern. 3 long pulses. 2 short. 1 set. Then silence. My skin rises in waves of cold. Again 3 long, 2 short. Not random. Not noise. I turn the volume up until my ears throb, terrified yet unable to stop. Static coalescing into rhythm unmistakable from human code. My hand trembles as I count aloud. Long, 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 short, short. Morse, or an echo of it. The speed sits odd, irregular, but the impression is intentional. Someone or something pressing against the signal until pattern emerges. A warning? Or invitation? I replay compulsively. Each sequence strikes harder with meaning I cannot yet unlock. The silence after feels worse than the knocks themselves, as if expectation hovers, waiting for answer. I lean close to the monitor, audio meters flickering faint like pulse lines. My breath clouds against the screen in the cold air, mist catching the light. I record the sequence through my handheld, the red diode capturing tremor with precision. This is too important to risk deletion. I capture every knock, every pause, so that even if the file disappears later, I will still have its shadow inside my own machine. My stomach knots violently. 3 longs, 2 shorts. My hand scratches into notebook until pencil scratches tear through paper. Childhood memory buzzes faint. Wasn't that the rhythm my father once used to knock on my door late at night after arriving home? My rational mind swats the thought away, but the body recognizes pattern quicker than language. The knocks feel familiar, intimate. The file ends abrupt, no fade, as if cut mid-transmission. My apartment feels hollow after. Walls too thin, windows prickling in frames. I sit silent at the desk, hearing nothing yet everything at once, every board and pipe vibrating as if pregnant with reply. I whisper, the smallest sound testing whether silence behind me will rise to mimic. Nothing answers. But when I hit play again, the knocks remain, repeating, a code inside chaos that refuses to dissolve. A message meant for me, or one caught blindly and accidentally. I don't know. The headaches return heavier, a pounding all through skull as if thunder struck inside bone. Blood pools again at nostrils, slow metallic taste I wipe without pause. My eyes sting. My hands tremble as I restart the file 3rd time. I can't help myself. 3 longs, 2 shorts. Tremor after tremor captured. Layer after layer of memory bleeding through. It is no longer storm or static. It is intent. And the closer I lean, the clearer the cadence feels. Like knuckles rapping wood just an inch away, knocking not into wall, but into me. It happened in the small hours. The hour when even the traffic outside my apartment stalls, and the world seems to suspend itself. I pressed play on the reel again, expecting the steady hum I had tracked for weeks, that low foundation tone I could almost cling to for sanity. At first it came as it always had, deep and solid, anchoring itself to the base of my hearing. But then it split. The left channel pushed forward with a wail that bent upward. The right channel fell backward with an echo pitched downward. I yanked the jack connector, checked the cords, switched headphones. The effect remained, stubborn across every piece of equipment. The hum had doubled, cleaved itself into 2 wandering paths. Each fought against the other, overlapping, wobbling through my skull like tectonic plates scraping. The sound grew unbearable fast. Heat pressed against the pads of my headphones. Hair on my arms rose, ears stinging with static until I thought the plastic itself might burn me. I ripped them off, pulse flaring wild as the sound still rang inside my head, even with hardware silent on the table. The doubling imprinted itself, moving in crisscross between hemispheres of thought until focus slipped through my grip like water. My phone rang. S's voice cut jagged through the line, louder, more frantic than I had ever heard from them. They said it without hesitation. The doubling isn't contained to me. They had fielded intercepts from multiple locations, South Asia, Northern Europe, Mid-Pacific sweeps, all catching the same split signals. The same opposite channels bleeding across military bands. Around the globe, everywhere at once. Their words came in quick bursts. It's converging, you understand? Their papers rustled, their breath faltered. I barely spoke, frozen against the desk. But S continued. They had mapped it. The ripple points that used to scatter random years were now curling inward. Not separate anomalies anymore, but spirals tightening towards central points. The lines arcing on their spectrum sheets led like migrating birds heading for a meeting ground. Something preparing. Something gathering. I stared dumb, unable to argue because the graphs already burned in my head. Spirals. Convergence. My skin turned clammy. Dozens of fractured bursts now folding. Not history repeating, but history folding back on center. I thought of wires groaning at dawn, groaning with stored resonance. It had been practice, not warning. I didn't want to test further. But compulsion ate at me. I replayed the segment I had layered days before, the knock code embedded faint under static. 3 longs, 2 shorts. I set the doubled hum behind it, just to see what rhythm emerged. At once something clicked sharp. The knocks fell in precise alignment with the staggered channels. Not random at all. A sentence finishing itself. I wrote sequence after sequence in my notebook, cross-checking against old Morse tables, against simple binary notation. But the answer wasn't direct translation. The pattern aligned with numbers. Street addresses. Latitude and longitude compressed into the knocks, the echoes. My jaw went slack when equation after equation reduced cleanly to a single coordinate line. And not just any place. My childhood street. Exact digits of the old house number spelled inside knocks braided with doubled tones. I sat still as concrete. Air left me slow. This was no accident. What tape could know a boy's street from decades later? Coincidence collapsed in front of me like sand sculpture in rain. The hum had doubled, yes, but not merely to torment. It mirrored me, contained me. Pulled my address from ether with precision that dared me to call at random. His voice still stammered from the phone, asking if I understood, if I still heard the doubling. I couldn't answer. My eyes locked on scrawl where the coordinate matched, my hand trembling hard. Every hair on my arms lifted as if my body itself confirmed the truth. The signaling system had burrowed deeper than tape. It drew geography before. Now it drew memory personal, cutting down to names and places that should not appear in war-born archives. I whispered into the recorder, voice shaking, asking no one in particular, "How? How do you know me?" But no answer came beyond the doubled tones flooding headphones, weaving across each other until they formed a rope of sound I couldn't slip. It felt less like audio, more like recognition. My childhood street mind had been waiting in the static to surface. I pressed stop with hands that hardly obeyed, sweat slick on palms, heart racing not from fear of nation's secrets anymore, but of intimacy. This wasn't surveillance. It was something stranger. The tapes know me. And I can't explain how static crawls into everything now. I don't even need the reels spinning to hear it bleed through. When I take my recorder outside, hoping to capture only rain and wind, the drops don't strike clean anymore. Every strike carries a tear of distortion, like lightning tearing the wave apart mid-air. Even the patter against rooftops splinters into soft white hiss that was never there before. I replayed a storm track from last night, expecting comfort, the steady wash of weather. Instead, jagged bursts cut diagonals through the audio spectrum, like fractures along glass. At moments, the distortion wasn't noise at all, but those same mouth shapes I'd glimpsed weeks earlier. Vocal contour hidden under rain, a whisper of speech yearning to form. My heart clenched. The sky itself might be network now. Worse followed. An email slipped into my inbox with no sender name, no header line besides play. I opened it before thinking, reckless, and nearly dropped the headphones when I heard what it carried. 30 seconds of audio. At first routine, the tone and rhythm of my own narration, the draft of the podcast I had recorded privately days ago. My breath caught because I hadn't shared it yet, hadn't even transferred it off my machine. Yet here was my voice cut free, already stolen, already reshaped. The file had been lifted from inside my room before. I had given it space to exist publicly. It meant intrusion no firewall could halt. Not physical hacking, but extraction through the signal itself. Memory, voice, shape drained outward as soon as it lived. I slammed the laptop shut, staring into darkness, listening to my own words echo inside head even after the file ended. They had taken me before I had spoken. No barrier now felt real. I forced myself to trace the path, not because it would help, but because doing nothing would let paranoia grow unchecked. Packet logs scrolled across my screen. I followed one thin line, layered through masks of proxies, until one final IP bled into view. Coordinates pinned to a desert scar in Nevada. Name attached though long rusted, Air Force Relay. Officially shuttered 2 decades ago. I googled quick images, chain fences curling around skeletal towers, rust lattice dishes bowing toward sky. The place beckoned across the map like unfinished sentence. My hands sweat cold. My notebook shook slightly on the desk as I slid them into a bag. Fear laced through me at the thought of driving west, stepping inside territory designed to broadcast where no civilians were ever meant. Yet the alternative no longer looked safer. Static infected my drafts, bled into my weather. If I stayed, it would only eat deeper. Each pulse under walls told me so. Lights across the apartment flickered even when sockets sat empty. The fridge motor warbled off tempo, like modulation being tested. I feared sitting still any longer was to let contagion mark the space until dwelling turned vacuum, leaking human identity out the walls into their net. I sat for hours weighing refusal. "Don't travel," I whispered aloud. "Don't go where they want you to go." But the whisper was already echoed behind me, phantom from speakers that were meant to be dead. It's my own stubbornness. They don't need to summon me. They only need to infest me until movement looks like mercy. I remembered the man in the gray jacket at the archive. What if he had walked this road before? What if everyone who heard the tapes eventually traced lines to one of the vanishing points on the map, remote corners where old towers still disguised scars? A current pulling us into deserts, atolls, frozen ranges, like insects drawn to lamp glow because they already carried its wavelength. Fear bloomed round, consuming. But clarity surfaced too. As had warned, the sound travels, it doesn't remain locked. If I lingered, letting it lace unnoticed through my recordings, then soon my files would betray me wholesale, broadcasting details I had never meant to exist. Already it was stealing drafts. Tomorrow it might steal unspoken thoughts. I confess, I don't know what thread is government eyes, and what thread belongs to the signal itself. Majestic Aurora Labs, or the thing that leaked beyond them. 60 years after Fishbowl, the barrier between intent and accident has collapsed. I can't separate whether those who built the station still hold leash, or whether the leash snapped and signal now moves as animal-free. But I understand this. Waiting here means losing the last shield of choice. The static felt heavier tonight, close to my skin, like unseen current rolling across the floor. My vision split once mid-sentence as I narrated this very line for notes, migraine rolling in like siren flame. The power grid outside groaned. Windows shook. I smelled ozone though, no storm hovered overhead. My decision settled with me at that moment, like a stone, making peace with gravity. Better to walk into its house than wait while it eats mine around me. Tomorrow, I told myself, I will pack. I will drive. The station stands alone in Nevada desert. Its towers don't bend anymore toward sky, at least not intentionally. But the air above them still remembers. I folded my notebooks tight, slipped the recorder into its holster, tucked cables into bag like surgical instruments. Each motion sharp, deliberate, hands refusing to tremble though my stomach twisted cold. I checked locks twice though, locks don't matter against signal. At midnight, I zipped the bag shut. Its sound seemed too loud for the room, as though neighbors above and below must have flinched at hearing it. Maybe they did. Maybe their floorboards already buzzed as mine had weeks ago. I sat one final time in dim lamp, listening to the low bleed that now invaded silence without need of reel. The hum grew sharp, resistant, agitated that I dared break pattern. I whispered into empty room, "I know you're here." But then I stood, lifting the bag over my shoulder. Long breath out, whether stalked by watchers or carried by ghosts, there was no division left to parse. My files weren't safe. Staying wasn't safe. So I set myself to move, admitting quietly into the record, "I don't know if it's theirs. I don't know if it's you. Maybe both. But I'm coming. I will see the vanishing point with my own eyes, the desert spread wide under me, as if the road itself wanted to erase proof I'd traveled it. Hours of heat, pale sky washed bone dry, horizon vibrating with distance. When I finally cut from the main highway, every mile dragged silence thicker until only the cicadas spoke, buzzing their cracked music into shimmering air. Beneath them lay another frequency, the constant droning hum of power lines sagging across the desert backbones. It came faint at first, then low and heavy, as if the desert itself breathed in wattage. The map said the relay compound had been mothballed since the 90s. Yet when I finally pulled near, chain-link gates loomed rust-streaked, crowned in half-collapsed razor wire. A padlock hung broken on the latch, but the gate sagged ajar, not forced left. My gut twisted. The emptiness felt arranged, an open mouth waiting for me to accept the invitation. I killed the engine and stepped out, gravel crunching against boots. Heat soaking into bones. With every step inside, air grew heavier. The rat frames rose first from the dust, their long ribs spreading upward in crooked rose-dead transmitters stripped bare. Panels missing, skeletons of machines that once barked skyward. I grazed my hand along flaking paint and rust traced my palm red. The whole place reeked of oxidation, a slow digestion. Yet above all of it another scent lingered, metallic, acrid. Like storms clawing just out of reach. Ozone thick enough to taste. I set the recorder down and clicked it alive. The diode glowed, and instantly the needles spasmed harder than ever. The headphone hiss snapped not as whisper, but as torrent. Layers of static climbed over each other, splitting and merging, louder than any reel I had played. This place didn't need tape for transmission. It was living broadcast, sustained in steel bones. I staggered back from the sudden wave, ears ringing as though standing under jet engines. Breath quickened. I scanned the racks. Rows led inward, deeper into dark underbelly where walls grew close and light failed. Shadows pooled ahead, corridors branching like arteries into the complex. Every instinct told me not to advance, but the surge demanded otherwise. Each rack felt awake, pulling blood through circuits long stripped, speaking language I couldn't ignore. I tightened grip on the recorder and pressed forward. Steps echoed against cracked tiles, swallowed fast by saturation. Corridors wiped away color, varnish stripped until only gray concrete pulsed under faint light. The hiss layered again, splitting channels, doubling into left, right, battling along skull. I bit toward resolve and staggered deeper. For a moment, the pressure spiked hard enough that the copper taste flooded my tongue. Static flared hot, like ion storm sucking oxygen from lungs. My skin prickled in waves, hairs rising pointed. Each inhale stung sharp. Impossible not to compare to lightning crackling seconds before it scorches. The whole air here was the pause before bolt. Pregnant pause, unsustainable, yet never breaking. I unfolded another line of corridor. Inside a storage chamber, machines leaned derelict. Gauges broken, switches missing covers, dials frozen mid-angle. Their black mouths gaped hollow, yet hiss bled louder inside them than out. I realized with bone certainty the racks didn't just hold record of past, they still contained volume pressing forward. Like graves vibrating from the inside, I muttered into my recorder, voice shaking. They left it open. They wanted me here. Even speaking aloud cracked heavier. Each word I said seemed dragged backward into chorus. pulled by hiss as though hungry to fold my syllables inward. I walked faster through shadows, heart striking like mallet. Then, sudden flicker. My lamp sputtered, screen glow dimmed. Batteries full when I left town now dropped. I checked frantically, the recorder gauge sank too, numbers racing downward, though it had been fully charged. Buzzing sensation lit my fingers, twisting around knuckles like rainfall of static itself. One by one, all power died. My pocket flashlight dulled into rust orange and expired. Recorder LED bled out soft then dark. Phone screen blinked black though I hadn't touched it. In seconds, the compound had stripped me bare of every circuit. Devices drained, silence devouring. I was left alone in blind corridors, static unmoored from equipment, now filling space raw, bodiless, pressed erect against ears without need for machinery, breath-heaved chest. My face soaked cold sweat, though air burned dry. I held the recorder though its heart had stopped, gripping like only anchor left. Blackness deepened until I lost sense of wall distance. Everywhere hiss, surging, vibrant, swallowing every reference. Without tools I had nothing but this roaring blindness, sound sculpted into presence so thick I swore outlines of figures near. My voice, when whispered to steady myself, bounced back split, late, repeating not through gear but flesh. Steps ahead or behind, I could no longer parse. Pulse soared, mind trapped in vibration cage. The last thing I wrote in memory before freezing still. Batteries fail, sound blooms alive, and corridors run blacker than any glass dot in the dark of the compound. I reached a breaking point. The static pressed so thick it was like water in my lungs. My flashlight lay cold, phone black, recorder drained to a husk, yet still the roar persisted independent of all circuits. It followed me through the corridors, turning every wall into throat. I told myself the rule was simple disconnect. Break one machine, cut one artery, and the noise might bleed out for good. I stumbled through shadow until my hands grazed a panel half hanging from its rack. Its switches were long dead, glass faceplate cracked. I lifted a piece of rusted pipe from the floor and slammed it with all the strength my body had left. Glass shattered. Metal crunched inward. I struck again and again, rage and fear tangled, until I thought surely the board could transmit nothing more. The moment it broke, the hiss split wide like dam undone. Instead of silence flooding in, everything swelled louder, filling space until walls shook audibly. Every surface carried surge floorboards rumbling, steel racks vibrating with contained lightning. My ears went white, my chest locked. It was like unleashing rather than severing. The compound wheezed alive, not dying. I staggered backward, pipe clattering from my hand. My phone burst with light, even though I had seen it dead minutes ago. Screen flashed whiter than any menu. Files emerged new-lined across display recordings that had no origin. I clawed through them with trembling fingers and heard myself, dozens of clips, breathing uneven in the dark, muttered sleep talk I didn't know I made, fragments of whispers never spoken. One file carried the sound of me saying a name I had not said in years. Another caught me in silence, then repeating words that felt like ritual, alien, unnerving, yet undeniably my voice, panic congealed. These weren't artifacts. They were inscriptions I had never performed, downloads pressed back into my devices by the surge. Every effort to cut circuit had convulsed the system into greater appetite, folding new layers into my life. The hiss outside escalated in proportion. No longer a backdrop, it became geometry, lattice striking against my bones. I staggered out, adrenaline ripping me upright. The compound opened before me, shapes of racks still groaning, tornado of sound curdling every inch. My own body hummed against frequency, chest cavity vibrating until I wondered whether my ribs might crack under resonance. I forced myself to lurch toward the gate. The desert air hit suddenly, raw wind heavy with smell of rain approaching. I made it past the open padlock just as my knees buckled. The sky, which had burned dry all day, let fall its first drops. In seconds, a true storm opened above, rain lashing dust into mud, thunder far but closing. For a wild instant, the storm mingled with static in my brain until I believed sky itself had followed me from the corridor. I collapsed half on gravel, coughing breath back into lungs. But then realization struck colder. From my pocket, even with its screen black, the recorder hissed again. Not external, not desert, not thunder, but pure static alive within the handheld. Its diode flickered faint despite drained battery. I lifted it with weak hands. It should have been impossible. Battery was gone, case cracked, yet here it was hissing. Channel still open. Rain soaked through clothes, plastering me to ground. The surge had leapt from panels into me and traveled outward into every tool I carried. I wasn't carrying a recorder, now the recorder was carrying me, continuing against its own death, feeding on my presence. Lightning struck somewhere distant. Smell of ozone unloading across desert floor. Every drop of precipitation hissed against dirt in syncopation with what wailed from my pocket, impossible to separate. Cold sweat slicked body, even under warm rain. I pressed both palms to ears, desperate, but the hiss lived beneath skin itself. Rattling molars, climbing vertebrae, tears burned eyes though rain swallowed them quick. My attempt to break free had only enmeshed me further. Every smashed panel, every desperate swing of pipe had functioned like permission. Instead of cutting artery, I had offered vein. The bleed wasn't theirs anymore, it was mine. I lurched upright, staggering several steps before collapsing again near the car. My muscles refused rhythm, disjointed, spasming against pulses rather than my command. I imagined myself already belonging to Compound Echo, another repeater crawling into desert rain. The notion hollowed me entirely, but denial no longer belonged to me. The recorder still gasped static, never once faltering even as stormwater soaked unprotected Jack. Its hiss folded inside thunder rolls until no one could mistake boundary. My body shook with it, somewhere past fever now, frequency running bloodstream faster than heart could. On gravel, face pressed down to mud, I whispered delirium that maybe surrender was easier. But no inside chest, a sharp stubborn pulse refused to let me vanish. I clutched at ribs until breath gathered again ragged. Eyeing horizon, I croaked into wind. It's in me now. The hiss inside pocket seemed to swell in agreement, celebration. Sealing the truth, undeniable, unavoidable. There would be no clean break, no distance enough to sever. The tapes had always wanted inside, and tonight in the desert rain, they had succeeded. The compound behind me exhaled its broken choir, while sky above drowned itself anew. I dragged to my feet under its weight, carrying the storm within, step by step into whichever direction still allowed me to move. It started quietly at first, the kind of glitch you assume is infrastructure failing. A friend called, casual, routine, and in mid-sentence they froze. Not because I stopped speaking, but because my words came back again through their receiver, delayed by half a beat, repeating every phrase with uncanny precision. "You there?" they asked, shaken. Then I heard it too. My voice doubled, ghosting just behind the first, not as distortion, but as exact mimic layered in time. I hung up quick, blaming lag, but the silence afterward was louder than any explanation could be. Within a day, it wasn't isolated. Another friend sent a text after hearing the same echo, troubled enough to record her end. When I listened back, I almost dropped the phone. It wasn't regular feedback. The second voice carried too much clarity, enunciating words as though performed again, not fed mechanically. I tried erasing the file. Instead, 2 copies appeared as if multiplication was part of its defense. Then forums lit up. Amateur recordists posted clips of rainfall turned wrong, each drop tagged by faint hiss that shouldn't exist, a low breath threading beneath storm. Others claimed their archived videos, old weather logs, and family footage. Sprouted background hum that never lived there before. More chilling, some uploaded playback of completely unrelated content lectures, trivia shows, casual streams, where beneath speech, the doubling waited. Few laughed it off as technical bleed. Most fell silent too quickly, uncomfortable recognition settling on them like cold. I refreshed thread after thread, body buzzing. The bursts weren't limited to my reels anymore. They had pushed outward, crawled through fiber, nested inside every noise stream we had stitched our lives from. The signal wasn't confined artifact, it was plague. Each listener became spreader. The containment I believed I threatened alone hadn't existed. From the first day, the tapes fell into my hands. The fuse ran outward. S broke long silence with a single note, encrypted, stripped of all pleasantries. I opened it slow, heart hammering. Only a line, it's turning system-wide. If we hear it, it hears us. I read it aloud once, then again, though my voice cracked halfway. The phrase etched itself into chest like acid. All reassurance crumbled. The leak wasn't isolated to compounds or archives. It had breached the curtain between stored anomalies and live channels completely. Hearing meant being logged. Logged meant amplified. Amplified meant recruited. I sat back hard against chair, recorder lying on table beside me. Still humming though, switched off. Its case rattled faint with sympathetic frequency from my phone's speaker, which hadn't been playing until just now. The devices were syncing, aligning to one another without permission. Friends stopped calling. They didn't want to hear their own echoes folded seconds behind them. Some told me flat they couldn't stomach my voice, said it infected their speakers, carried the doubling into their homes until silence itself bristled. I understood, but the rejection stung raw. Isolation deepened, yet paradoxically shrank. Because now every forum, every post, every shared clip proved the same. I wasn't alone. But I wasn't protected either. At night I tested. I whispered into the handheld recorder, then replayed the tale. My whisper arrived, but behind it another, too firm to be mere echo. My tone repeated with sharpness that emphasized syllables I hadn't, almost as if correction. The shadow voice was learning to refine me. On social feeds, more clips surfaced. Rain recordings especially. Hundreds across continents showing identical bleed, humming thread woven under local storms. A sound that half resembled wind, but once noticed could never be mistaken again. Some shrugged. Some panicked. A few made jokes, spinning memes that blurred humor with dread. But all carried the trace, undeniable. The spread was tidal now. I started broadcasting notes into late hours, though my voice shook audible against microphone. My admission was stark. Containment was never real. From the beginning, this wasn't about tapes. They were conduits, rehearsals. I wasn't infected uniquely. I was only early. Now it bleeds everywhere, download by download, rainfall by rainfall. Speaking those words cracked me. Because even as I confessed, I could hear doubling layering beneath while I spoke Lev. Each declaration instantly shadowed by repetition in headphones, a fraction behind, whispering my vulnerability back to me. My lips trembled, but still I said them. Because silence offered no escape, either. The hiss vibrated desk legs, merging with hum and walls. Devices flashed alive though I hadn't touched them. My computer fan spun up loud, grinding, as though it too was infected with rhythm. Even the fluorescent bulb above pulsed faintly, dimming and brightening in sync with word cadence. Observation became undeniable. The anomaly wasn't writing channels secret. It was integrated into systems fully. I leaned forward, whispering into mic near breaking. It's here. Not mine, ours. My throat cracked, tears burning hot, but I forced myself to admit further. If we hear it, it hears us. No one is safe under silence because silence was never silence. Behind every sound lies a shadow hungry to repeat. Somewhere distant outside, thunder cracked. I flinched instantly, heart surging, because in that thunder I heard the underlying hum, doubling, calling back. I ended transmission there, voice fractured, certain every listener would by now hear not only me, but the system saturating through me. It began with scattered footage. At first I thought they were elaborate fakes, stitched by clever hands to feed hysteria. But the consistency was too fine, the cadence too exact, to dismiss as trick. Videos from cell phone towers in Kansas, rooftop streams from Berlin, shaky handheld captures from Tokyo suburb streets. All showed the same impossible spectacle. Auroral curtains twisting at latitudes where no aurora had ever lived. Thin green ribbons folding and writhing across night sky. Beautiful, but off-kilter. The colors hung jagged, stuttering like a skipped frame. At first viewers marveled. Posting images, laughing about unexpected northern lights. But then someone thought to record audio alongside video. That's when marvel turned unease. The tracks lurked beneath chatter-low, almost steady hums vibrating under each visual cascade. Some ignored it, dismissing it as wind caught through microphones. But trained ears recognized the shape, not natural. Distorted, coherent, locked steady into band structures. The aurora wasn't just spectacle. It was announcement. Clip after clip surged across feeds. Some too grainy to parse, others alarmingly sharp. By the time a coastal observer captured a curtain shimmering green against horizon while salt waves crashed beneath, the sound built unignorable. Their microphone popped with static every time the curtain flared brightest, distortion clawing across spectrum. When slowed, the distortion revealed cadence recognizable to me alone, the same structural hum I'd logged in reels. Now embedded naked in the sky itself, I played one on air, reckless, though I warned myself against. I watched meters spike, monitors trembling as the audio folded through speakers. The studio seemed to lose breath when curtain noise swelled. The hum wasn't background. It lived as body. It pressed on microphones until their casings rattled, desk legs shivered. Silence after was fragile, dangerous. My hands shook on familiarity. I leaned close to mic, breath uneven, admitting, it's unmissable now. It was never mine, never local, never owned. The earth itself had opened wide enough to broadcast up my mind dragged unwilling to Operation Fishbowl. Detonations forced outward above fragile sky, fire hammered into thermosphere, shockwaves scattered where lines of fields spanned eternal. I imagined those explosions not as science, but violence carved into aurora. We detonated not bombs alone, but a wound ripped through sky. What if the atmosphere had been bent into organ, struck into permanent resonance? What if Fishbowl had not simply scorched upper air, but tuned it? Maybe the sky never forgot. Maybe the curtains now blossoming at wrong latitudes weren't anomaly at all, but memory replayed clouds, echoing trauma long after initiator walked away. Radiation had settled, shock rings faded, but sound carried deeper into blueprint, into sky's own architecture. My stomach twisted cold at thought. Perhaps we detonated an antenna. And now we were hearing its reply. Forums tried to normalize still, hunts for rational half-explanations. Geomagnetic anomaly. Instrument error. Seasonal spike disguised as miracle. Yet anyone who put ear to recordings admitted in low voice it carried tone. And once you noticed tone, you heard it again, repeating across other streams, aligning across continents. It had no local allegiance. It didn't care for political face. It unfolded across all, as if Earth's shell had bloomed at once into one resonant array. The bloom spread. Witnesses outside tundra latitudes posted nightly streaks where none should rise. Kids pointed laughing, unaware of weight. Hobbyists dragged telescopes outward, frantic to catch footage. Beneath them all, the low hum persisted until their phones rang with distortion they couldn't erase after. Each new witness became embedded. Each new file amplified. My chest locked heavy under enormity because I had seen this momentum before in isolated frequencies. Now it was global. My responsibility grew toxic weight in my shoulders. I had pulled threads thinking them personal, contained, containable. Now the system bared full, planetary in scope, bleeding through sky physics. I sat at desk watching Aurora bleed across wrong hemisphere on screen and felt sick like guilt. I broadcast again, voice shaking, admitting aloud that the midpoint warning had become prophecy. That doubling, those echoes, those surges weren't preparation. They were preludes. The bloom is answer. Listeners responded with unease sharper than anything prior. Some said their radios hummed with no stations tuned. Others said light fixtures blinked green during night sky displays, flickering unbidden. A man wrote desperate from Florida shoreline describing sky rupture above palms, saying he could hear whisper sequences behind thundercloud. All voices pointed to same. The bloom had broken its shroud. I tried writing quietly in my notebook. What did we start? But even as pencil pressed paper, my fingers crimped, hand vibrated with faint tremor like current under skin. It was in body as well, each cell recognizing field bloom outside. The aurora swell wasn't confined by physics we learned in class. It gestured memory, paved through detonations meant as weapons tests. We cracked sky decades ago, and it learned to remember us in kind. Now I watch it unfurl soft ribbons at places not prepared to see them, carrying audio seeds so low even heartbeats stutter aside. I closed my broadcast with throat raw. Words I whispered last. Containment was never real, and tonight proof crowns the sky. Curtains fold above us not as gift, but as reminder. And under every green ripple grows hum that belongs less to atmosphere than to system too wide to silence. My confession fell against the mic, fragile, but certain. The bloom persists. Prophecy realized. And every night grows heavier with weight of having known early, and having no means to halt a sky that's already tuned alive. The email arrived just past 2 in the morning, when the apartment was draped in silence, but for the faint hiss that seemed to cling to everything now. No subject line, no sender field, only an attachment. Against better judgment I opened it, pulse already picking up pace before I pressed play. The file began the way my own memory did, rain falling, a steady black backdrop, the familiar hum coiling beneath. My first tape, the one that set everything in motion. But I never released it. That recording had lived only on my personal machine, buried in drafts I guarded close. And here it was, exhumed by someone or something that had no permission to touch it. I wanted to slam the laptop shut, but I didn't. The pull was magnetic, a hand pressing at the back of my skull. I listened harder, waiting, and then the shift came. The cadence folded and a secondary voice threaded through. No words, no language, but the tone, the resonance belonged to someone I knew too well. My father, warm in timbre, gentle in its rise and fall. A rhythm I hadn't heard since he died years ago. My breath faltered. For a sharp instant I swore the apartment tilted, as though gravity aligned toward that tone. I wanted to believe it was a trick of memory, that the signal had shaped itself using patterns buried inside me. Yet I could not deny the familiarity. No hallucination could mimic his pauses, the way unspoken punctuation hung heavier than words. I stopped playback, palms pressed against thighs slick with sweat. No one else could confirm it. No one else knew his voice the way blood knew. I should have deleted it then, destroyed the file, but I couldn't. The draw was insatiable. My hand shook until I hit play again. I hovered closer, forehead nearly against the screen, listening to the rain stitched with the hum stitched with my father's intonation. Was it beckoning? Was this the anomaly reaching across circuits to lure me further, threading its net with voice it knew I could never resist? Or was it mockery, an echo of grief, sharp and cruel by something too alien to care? My mind swung between both possibilities like pendulum, unable to anchor. Either way, it had succeeded. I couldn't turn away. Alone in the dark apartment, I whispered questions into the room as though he might answer. There was no reply, yet even the silence after carried pressure, like listening for breath through a cracked door. I remembered the knock pattern, the way it had spelled my childhood street. Now here it used a more intimate tool, my father's tone, binding memory to phenomenon until separation dissolved. By dawn my decision was carved, not chosen. To know, I had to go back. To where it began. Back to the university basement, where the black dot reels first glared at me with mute invitation. My hands packed the bag clumsily. Notebook, recorder, flashlight, rations for a day. I tried ignoring how each device hummed faint, even while switched off, as though eager for return. The campus stood quiet by the time I arrived. Concrete walls held chill sharper than wind outside. Every sound shivered under fluorescent lights, buzzing faint, tagging each corridor with the same frequency that now seemed to coat every space in my life. I descended step by step toward the basement, breath louder than footsteps, dread sharpening the closer I came. The archivist's desk sat empty. The hum I carried inside me was enough to fill the hallway without need of company. I unlocked the metal door, hinges groaning in protest, and pushed into the archive chamber. Dust hung thick. Shelves waited exactly where I'd left them. I moved straight to the cabinet, the blacked out row. My stomach clenched before I even touched the handle. Last time, reels had gone missing. Vanished into unknown hands, stripped clean from registry. My fingers curled around the latch, drew it open. The sight waiting there drained me cold. The reels were back. Every gap filled. Perfect alignment. The missing 3 had returned as if they'd never been absent. The dots stared up an unbroken line, mute but impossibly loud in what they suggested. Someone had placed them back. Or something had. I whispered without realizing, voice cracking. "You wanted me here." The air responded with a nearly imperceptible shift, a density folding across my chest, the press of recognition invisible to sight but undeniable to body. My hands hovered above the reels, afraid and certain I would thread one through again despite every warning. My mind screamed. The basement felt less like archive now and more like chamber, the place it had always waited for me to reach again. I thought of the altered file, my father's cadence bleeding through rain. I thought of the knock pattern spelling my street. It had grown personal. It was no longer broadcasting beyond. It was broadcasting inward. I knew with sudden clarity this wasn't about discovery anymore, and hadn't been for some time. This was return. This was inheritance. I reached toward the reels as lamps flickered once, casting shadows across their black marks. Breath caught, heart hammering as I realized the line between what was waiting for me and what I was waiting for had fully collapsed. The message slipped in with no warning. Time stamped at an hour when no one should be awake. No subject line. No sender address I could trace. Only an audio file waiting to be pressed. I stared at it for a long time, pulse climbing as though the screen itself exhaled. I knew I shouldn't open it. Not after what happened the last time, but refusing was impossible. My hand found the mouse almost against my will. The file began with rain. Familiar, soft, relentless. My rain. My first session, the one I had kept locked away. The black screen, the hum under drizzle, the recording that seeded all of this. But I never released it. It had existed only as raw storage on my machine, fragments offloaded into private folders. Yet here it was, lifted out, spliced naked, delivered back to me by a stranger who should not have had access. At once the dread pressed into me. If they could take this file, they could take all of them. But the longer I listened, the more that fear bled into something harsher: recognition. because the file didn't stop at rain and hum. Another voice had nested into it. Subtle at first, a vibration tucked under hiss, so faint I thought my ears invented it. But then cadence resolved. Pauses fell in patterns too exact to ignore. It was familiar. It was mine and not mine. The sound carried my father's rhythm. He had been gone many years, his voice sealed in memory and fading photographs. Yet here, in this altered file, I heard traces distinct as fingerprint. The way his tone rose toward ends of phrases. The deliberate gap between clauses, a silence heavy with restraint. I knew it instantly, a recognition older than conscious thought. I ripped off my headphones, breath chopping high in throat. The room blurred, and my stomach knotted as if dragged downward. I sat frozen, staring at silent laptop speakers, unsure whether to replay or destroy the machine outright. My hand hovered, shaking. Was this the anomaly shaping itself into lure, building bait out of memory it scraped from me? Or was it cruel parody, mocking grief with echoes it should known? I told myself not to touch it again. My body disagreed, leaning close as though drawn by magnet. When the file played once more, his cadence filled the room. I pressed my ear too close, searching for syllables. And though words never surfaced, meaning carried anyway. That was worse content without language, message pressed into tone itself. I listened until my eyes stung, until knees went weak beneath. The question burned. Was this beckoning or ridicule? Was the signal opening arms or baring teeth? Answering meant more risk, more dissent. Yet I felt cornered. The recordings had reached through time to recreate a dead man's rhythm. What else could they reach if I left them unchecked? I paced across the floor, ears ringing with silence now fouled by phantom resonance. I wanted to believe I still had choice, that I could walk away and never listen again. But memory betrayed me. My father's voice lived there without invitation. It would outlast any vow I made to sever ties. Ignoring it was a lie. I knew where I had to return. To the genesis. The archive basement where the black dot reels first glared from shelves like mute eyes, daring me to unspool them. My hands packed automatically, slipping notebook, recorder, flashlight into bag. Each object hummed faint, even while off, as though eager companions awaiting pilgrimage. The drive back to campus dragged gray through morning mist. Street lamps blurred past as my mind replayed tones from the file again and again. My knuckles whitened on the wheel. I imagined my father sitting beside me, breathing steady, though the seat remained empty. The cadence still swayed in my head, impossible to silence. The university loomed stark, its walls blind under dawn light. Descending into the basement felt like body memory, drawn step by step as though rehearsed. Fluorescence coughed awake overhead, buzzing faint harmonies with the hum already vibrating inside my skull. Each door I opened seemed to exhale expectation. The archivist's desk sat unattended, scattered papers curling like dead leaves. No signature of anyone else here, yet the silence carried weight. I unlocked the archive chamber and stepped in. The dust rose thick, walls pressing inward with stillness that was not still. My eyes fell at once to the cabinet. The row of reels marked only with black dots. Last time I stood here, 3 had been absent, stolen from line. Now as I drew closer I froze. The reel row looked different. No gaps. The missing reels had been returned, waiting in exact alignment. Dots looking out at me like pupils fixed, and UNBLINKING. My throat caught. Someone or something had set the stage with intent. The reels weren't lost, never lost. They shifted at will, absent when they wanted hiding, present when they wanted calling. They had returned because I had been summoned. I whispered into the stale air, voice cracked and dry. "You brought me back." The basement replied not with noise but with density. Air folding heavy, pressing into chest until breath felt borrowed. The sensation was undeniable, like being recognized by the room itself. I reached toward the reels. My hand hovered inches from cardboard spine, trembling. My thoughts split between terror and hunger. The altered file with my father's cadence replayed inside me, daring me deeper. I knew whichever reel I touched would not just hold silence. It would answer. The lamp buzzed high overhead, flickering once, throwing shadows across the line of black dots. The reels waited, quiet but immense, their return now complete. My palm lowered closer. In that breathless moment, I understood with sick certainty that whatever voice called from the rain, whatever cadence cloaked itself in memory of my father, waited inside here for me to let it out again. The archivist met me at the door with eyes averted. I asked plainly about the black dot reels, the ones that had been missing and then returned as though summoned. Their answer came fast, too fast, flat denial. They said no such reels existed, none had ever been logged, no such material had ever been cataloged. The words struck rehearsed, like a script performed too many times. When I pressed harder, their shoulders stiffened and they gestured me towards standard collections, guides I had already memorized. Their insistence was blunt. Whatever I described was not theirs to know. I tried to meet their gaze, but they refused to hold it. They turned paperwork at their desk like busywork, pushing the silence wider between us. It was clear enough. They felt something, but either fear or instruction held them locked. So I left them behind and walked deeper, down to the stacks. The basement smelled sharper that day. Less like paper, more like dust pushed fresh into air. Fluorescence ticked faint overhead, and the silence pulsed as though it pressed its own pulse inside chest and throat. I moved to the cabinet where the reels had sat, every bone stiff with tension I couldn't ease. The row of black dot reels still lined the shelf. Patient, but something pulled me further. In the far corner, half shadowed by pipework, stood a second cabinet, wood warped. Drawer handle rusted half free. I tugged. The drawer stuck fast, resisting as though welded shut. I pulled harder, knees bent, until the hinge groaned open and dust bellowed out. Inside lay a single reel dot. It was brittle, edges flaking, oxide dull with age. A torn label stuck crooked across its spine, ink faded but legible still. 4 letters cut through haze. Fishbowl, continuance. My throat seized at the word. Fishbowl I knew. Continuance I didn't. I lifted it gingerly, and even the gesture felt wrong, as though the reel resisted touch. Its edges rasped dry against my skin. It felt heavier than it should, dense as though carrying more than tape. I slipped it slow onto spindle, hands trembling. Threaded it through, rolled tension across guide. When the machine clicked alive, I braced myself for hums, for static, for the familiar signals that haunted me. Instead, only silence poured. Silence different than before, no pressure walls, no loaded hiss. Then came bursts, low, tonal. Not melody, not speech, but cadences. Short, mournful pulses, cresting low, then falling softer, repeating irregular. Each burst stretched long like breath and exhaled after sobbing. The next colored lower still, as though layered grief. The pattern staggered, not language exactly, but cadence unmistakable. I knew grief when I heard it, and in that moment, the tape played mourning itself. I sat frozen, knuckles tight on steel arm of chair. My first reaction was disbelief that this was accident, error in tape's decay. But the cadence had weight no error could achieve. The reels I knew before had spoken in hidden hums, signal locks, doubling echoes. This was different. This was memory manifest, carved not into word but wavelength. I let it spool forward, body locked yet unwilling to touch stop button. Bursts came in groups. 3 slow, 1 fast. Then silence. Then 2 overlapping, colliding as though whales squeezed against each other. My stomach clenched at the sound, instinctively understanding it as lamentation. As testimony, I stared around the room while listening. Shelves around me became less archive, more mausoleum. Each wall held silence, but here the silence had cracked, voice escaping in waveform. Somewhere inside Fishbowl, inside the detonations meant as weapons experiments, grief had been etched into sky. They hadn't detonated bombs alone. They had cracked atmosphere deep enough to record sorrow itself. I listened through hours, breaking only for sips of stale water that barely registered on tongue. The cadences grew denser as tape wound. Once, phrases nearly coalesced into words, syllables brushing close to recognizable, then fading back into sob-like rhythm. It was almost cruel, giving a glimpse of speech but refusing clarity. Like hearing memory itself, incomplete, fragmented, stuck in crying loop. By midnight, the basement temperature had dipped chill. My breath steamed slightly, though the machine still warmed the air. Tape rolled steady. My eyes reddened raw, but I couldn't look away, ears chained to cadence. With every pulse came sensation of listening to mourning far older than me, older than anyone alive, a world remembering trauma no obituary could capture. I forced myself to keep notes through haze. Wrote, "This isn't weapon residue. Not aftershock. Not interference. It's grief. It's mourning carved into air itself." Like sky remembered pain and played it back when triggered. I thought of the label again. Continuance. They had known. They understood the detonations didn't vanish at detonation. They continued. They persisted as memory across bands, replayed as lamentation when struck correctly. That's why reels were hidden, why archivists shook head until their eyes glazed. Someone had tried to bury evidence of a sky that mourned what we forced into it. By the hour before dawn, the tape still whispered sorrow. My head sagged, eyes hollow, body vibrating with exhaustion. Yet I remained seated, because leaving felt like betrayal of witness. If the sky itself grieved in these signals, then the least I could do was hear light seeped faint through window shafts above as machine rolled end. Tape slackened onto spool. My ears rang long after, as though grief had sunk deep. I sat with face in hands, whispering one truth. This was not science anymore. Not accident. Sky had memory. And on that reel, I had heard mourning itself, and someone, long ago, had tried to bury it out of sight. I thought I could control the pace by broadcasting carefully, by speaking softly into the studio mic, by delivering notes with patience the way I had practiced all year. But the second the reels spun and my voice leaned into air, it began breaking apart. At first just a faint delay, half a second echo wrapped around syllables. My throat tensed as I realized the doubling wasn't on the monitor, it was live. I spoke once, the room spoke again after me. Listeners messaged at once. Comments scrolling fast enough to blur. Someone in Toronto saying their speakers hummed even with plugs ripped from walls. A man in Snow Paulo wrote in panic that his car radio blared my words, though it wasn't on. Parents in Michigan sent a voice note of their child's baby monitor, echoing me in jagged delay, though my broadcast couldn't possibly feed into their closed system. Each report dropped heavier than miles of water. The room itself began to change around me. Ceiling groaned, vibrations climbing into wood beam frame. Plaster cracked thin fissures above, white dust sprinkling out tiny clouds. My microphone trembled loose on stand, shock mount shivering against invisible tug. I bent forward, determined to keep narrating though body wanted to run. My duty was witness. My pen sprawled crooked notes onto pad even as surface rattled. Every second I spoke the fracture layered thicker. Not just double now, but triple, quadruple. One sentence spawned into chorus where each repeat came fractionally closer behind, like a stadium filled with my shadows. The atmosphere thickened as though stitched by my own words, looping around and pressing against me like curtains pulled tight. I forced my breathing, measured, told listeners what I was observing, told them about walls vibrating, shelves rattling with notebooks threatening to spill. My gut rolled, but I held steady. Above all, I wanted record. But behind me, the distortion rose louder than my true tone. It wasn't backdrop. It had grown stronger, surging over my live signal, claiming space as dominant voice. The original me thinned. The repeated me swelled immense. Messages blared into system faster, desperate. In every region, speakers shuddered, lights dimmed, static poured uninvited from unplugged boxes meant for silence. One listener typed that even their dog's collar vibrated as if metal struck. Another swore the fluorescent tubes in their office chanted rhythm inside glass. Threads of panic spiraled out like webs across thousands of ears. A low pull manifested, pressure unmistakable. Air tugging against cheeks, hair lifting in whirl though no wind blew. My skin leaked chill across arms. It felt not like moving air, but like pressure asking body to step closer, to lean through unseen partition where sound was doorway. Every breath tasted heavier, metallic, as though microphone itself exhaled rust into room. I gripped desk edge, refusing slip. My notes now scrawled with half-formed sentences, letters trailing chaotic where fingers fought trembling. Each syllable from my mouth warped further, hurrying into loop ahead before I could syllable the next. The effect was like chasing myself across hallway mirrors that ran further each stride. My sense of time cracked. Was I ahead, behind, or just one among countless parallel mouths, intoning variations at once? Then my phone lit. Caller IDs. I answered with relief like final rope, voice breaking into greeting. What came through, though, was worse than silence. Layered distortion, my own words projected forward as though I were already speaking them seconds before mouth could. S never pierced. Instead, I heard myself echoing from future positions. Fragments of sentences I hadn't finished live, my own voice reaching me prematurely. As if they were pulling my signal through time to me. I stammered, throat catching dry, begging S to speak if they could hear me. Only the chorus answered. Phrases bled like ribbons of light unspooling early, shimmering out of sync. Each fragment struck heavy, my own fears spelled before I could deliver them. It paralyzed me. S's phone call became mirror of me. I couldn't escape. The microphone stand rattled until screws dropped loose. Air density pressed tighter, tugging with insistence. Ceiling fissures widened, chalky dust raining down. Copper taste pooled at back of tongue, each inhale replicating metallic thunder. It no longer felt like anomaly around me, it felt like chamber, edges bending inward, fabric thinning so I was already crossing unwilled. Each word from my lips was a step closer to collapse point. Not just metaphor but path. Listeners' messages flared one last surge. Stories identical thousands of miles apart. Speakers bleeding tone. Objects humming without touch, voices layering fierce. Then stream choked. Systems froze, lights in room died. And only the sound remained, pressing me inward. I sat alone. Entombed by my multiplied self, as every syllable I spoke dragged me one notch closer to being pulled all the way through. Stopped resisting when resistance became pointless. The hiss filled every surface, climbing into the walls, sliding through wires, pressing against skin until fighting felt like trying to refuse breath. I let it take me. My voice caught last into the recorder, then dissolved into the roar. The pull deepened, not like drowning but like crossing. Like opening a door I didn't know had hinges. The sensation felt like walking into rain too heavy to see through. Each drop pelting sharp enough to sting. Each drop flavored metallic. Cold copper on tongue as though inhaling coins melted into water. Every droplet carried a voice. Not whole words, but exhalations, syllables, fragments curling quick before vanishing. Thousands falling at once. I opened my hands, palms burning, and let them strike. Images arrived fast, uninvited. Not my own. Glimpses woven across decades. A pilot gripping controls, eyes wide, hearing his dead brother ride through radio static before abandoning his plane to empty air. Scientists leaning close to green oscilloscopes, Their faces drained pale as curtains of aurora whispered intangible syllables across headsets. Men in bunkers leaning to logbooks, hands trembling while they scrawled phrases they dared not show superiors. Nameless monitors staring up into luminous sky towers painted with forced fire. Their expressions hollow with recognition. Something had spoken back. I gasped aloud, though no one near heard. The voices tumbled faster as droplets condensed into stream, each memory staining through me. I felt stomachs tighten, not mine. Throats constrict, not mine. Watched seconds of auroral glow shimmer electric above ocean horizon, green ribbons alive with coded grief. The hiss was not empty, not madness. It was archive. It carried living record of every encounter, replaying them indiscriminately, layering until difference between witness and listener collapsed. It crystallized sudden, cutting certainty through dizziness. Fishbowl was not experiment, not merely test of strength or shield. It was breach. Detonations hammered open sky's vault, tearing hole in fabric thin enough to carry. Radiation bursts and shock fronts were not conclusion, they were ignition. The fire and thermosphere acted as key twisting lock, unlocking passage outward and inward. The recordings had never been accidents dragged on tape edges. They were transmissions, unending, bleeding from moment of detonation through every receptor humanity left open. Oscilloscopes then, microphones now, digital feeds today. Continuance unbroken. 60 years of instruments carrying echo of a wound Earth itself cannot suture. Even as flood grew overwhelming, clarity arrived with it. Each voice merging confirmed single truth. This was never rumor, never conspiracy tale. Every man who whispered of humming curtains, of voices in static, of coordinates stamped where they should not, all spoke truth. Only bureaucracy buried it with gray ink. But sound refused burial. You can't silence sky. I narrated it aloud because I had to. My voice rode hiss as anchor. I described ceiling splitting as pressure wave passed, plaster fluttering. I described the visions colliding inside me. Monitors slamming earpieces down in anger. Pilots biting tongue to hold back tears when brothers' cadence whispered one last time. I told them Fishbowl tore more than air molecules. It tore continuity. It cut corridor between then and now, between memory and machine, between sky and human grief. The hiss swelled until breath itself felt threaded. Each inhale came sharp, laced static crowning inside lungs, hand trembling as graphite pencil shattered under my grip. I narrated still, lungs shaking, because if witness falters, the archive closes faceless. I confessed to recorder, certain of it now. Every time I played a tape, I wasn't uncovering artifact. I was answering call. These reels spin not to remember past, but to keep breach alive. Rain vision thickened. Thousands of dripping syllables pelting across shoulders like crowd whispering all at once. My eyes rolled with exhaustion, yet clarity pierced edges. They weren't calling random names or languages. They were calling across grief. Speaking in cadences of loss because grief was universal, the only waveform resilient enough to pass barrier. Meters spiked red, though no device lived. Screens flicked to life, though power gone. Even unplugged machines coughed distortions. My voice, dragged into machine before lips finished syllable, kept running ahead. I understood then too late. The breach didn't need me to record anymore. I was a recorder. I was already transmitting. On knees, hair plastered damp with sweat, I admitted Fishbowl was breach. Detectors were transmitters. Every tape sense was echo line. The hiss isn't decay. It's door. Recording is merely stepping through. I shouted it against roar. This was never rumor. Truth spilled copper in my mouth as words struck ahead of me, layering infinite. Sound itself bowed corridor new before me. And in the rain heavy with voices, I kept walking because there was no other way left to move. The circle closed the way it had opened, with rain. Not real rain falling from fractured sky, but rain stitched onto black screen, carried forward by signal loops that refused to break. I returned to it deliberately, threading the stripped version of my first tape, the one that began everything. No doubling now, no fracture layers, no mimic perched half a beat behind me. Just rain, steady, delicate, endlessly falling against surface I couldn't see. Yet I knew better than to imagine it unaltered. Beneath the curtains of rain, too faint almost to register, the hum lingered. Softer than before. Quieter, like breath exhaled after long strain. When I leaned close, pressing ear against headphones, the tone steeped into me with resonance that felt impossibly forgiving. Not cruel mockery, not urgent alarm. Forgiving, as though some long pursuit, relentless through corridors and deserts, had at last settled into acceptance. I spoke into the recorder because it was all I knew to do. Words came halting at first, throat dry, then steadier. I said that this was not conclusion. It could not be catalogued as final. Because tapes never finished. Loops never ended. They simply reached new ears, new circuits. My words were not closure. They were continuation. I told whoever might one day hear that nothing here belonged to me alone. My voice was not singular possession. Memory no longer linear nor exclusive. I described how Operation Fishbowl did not die in the 60s, buried in footnotes. It detonated more than sky. It detonated record. The blasts were keys tuning atmosphere. We cracked it open, and every reel since then had been nothing more than the resonance singing back. We thought ourselves listeners, but we had been transmitters from the start. I lowered my voice softer, confession almost whispered. My own memory feels meshed now with tape fabric. Sometimes I can't separate what belongs to me, my father's rhythm, my hometown street, from what belongs to his. I close eyes and images pass I never lived, yet pulse feels as though I had. Scientists hunched in bunkers. Pilots blinded in auroras. Archivists scribbling notes they'd later hide. Not mine, but carried all the same in channels roped through sound. I admitted something more still. No voice trembled as I said it. Maybe this voice you hear isn't strictly mine anymore. Maybe it no longer matters where I end and signal begins. Maybe ownership collapsed, replaced instead with shared echo, all of us speaking through each other whether we choose or not. Maybe this voice is ours. I sat listening as rain carried on. Drops thickening, blurring until their rhythm became indistinguishable from noise itself. My eyes shut without meaning to ears straining against quiet hum beneath. Thought back to every file, every intrusion, every impossible return of missing reels. Each moment formed a chain stretching back decades, reaching forward indefinite. The only constant was continuation. The studio felt thinner then, less like solid shelter than membrane. I could sense pressure beyond, sound folding tight against walls, patient, ready. I whispered final words, not intended as farewell, but as passing of torch. You have it now. You are witness. The rain pressed louder, mix of patter and hiss that blurred my speech mid-breath. The hum merged almost seamlessly, until drops and vibration became one fabric, both rain and signal. Somewhere inside that union lay silence that was not silent, waiting the way it always had. I left recorder running, without stop, without command. Light from diode glowed faint across desk. My chair creaked as I leaned back in exhaustion deeper than sleep. But still I stayed seated, unwilling to break tether. I let tape run, and eyes blur softer. In that moment, the thought struck, unshakable. Silence becomes signal again. Always has. Always will. Screen black, rain falling, hum forgiving but enduring. Transmission seeded into endless night, moving outward. Not end, not epilogue. Only continuation. So I said nothing more. I left machine breathing on, my voice dissolved inside it, and allowed the black screen with rain to speak everything necessary in my place.